changes the course of human history. This thing changes the direction, that the ideology that these people subscribe to and the moral and ethical structure that they live their life by. It changes untold billions of human beings from that point on.
Does Joe Rogan believe in God? Does Joe Rogan believe in the resurrection? Does Joe Rogan believe the Bible is historically reliable? And how do you think Joe Rogan would respond when he's investigating the evidence for the origin of this Christianity, which exploded on the scene? In this video, we're going to talk about the questions Joe Rogan is asking that everyone needs to be asking about Jesus, the Bible, the resurrection, and the origin of the Christian faith. So be sure to stay to the end as I walk through the different clips and different topics that he talks about in this interview. It's fascinating, and it's really the biggest questions that we should all be asking. Hey everyone, Jonathan Morrow here, where I help you think about worldview and culture and everything in between. And this is a fascinating conversation. Please hit subscribe, like, share this with a friend. It helps me spread the word because these conversations matter. People like Joe Rogan are having these conversations, and it's important for us to think about them as well. So let's dive into this fascinating conversation about Joe Rogan and what he thinks about Jesus, the Bible, resurrection, and the origin of Christianity.
Changes the course of human history. This thing changes the direction, that the ideology that these people subscribe to and the moral and ethical structure that they live their life by. It changes untold billions of human beings from that point on.
Yeah.
Pretty fascinating.
Yeah.
That in itself, even if this is just a revelation without a divine interaction, that's a miracle.
Yeah.
It's a miracle that it was created at all.
Now, Joe Rogan right here is talking about the explosion of Christianity and how it came onto scene and what happened to go from nothing to now this massive impact, and that it's actually a miracle that you've got this new ideology, as he calls it, called Christianity, exploding on the scene, and why you have that to begin with. Now, what's going to happen is he's going to have to explore what's connecting the dots and what are the options looking at going
Like
forward.
the whole idea that Christianity, when you're saying that the book of, was it the book of Isaiah?
Yeah.
That the same book is exactly the same as, like, that's a miracle.
Yeah.
That's pretty crazy.
Yeah, that is crazy.
If you just imagine the sheer number of illiterate people, the sheer number.
Now, real quick, he's talking about the Isaiah scroll that was discovered at Qumran. And until that point, there was only the Masoretic text, which was around 1100 AD. And so what the Isaiah scroll did was it demonstrated the incredible copying accuracy that was going on, that the Hebrew scribes practiced. And you backed it up about 1,200 years or so, and it's basically 95, 98% copying accuracy, and the errors are just simply slips of the pen, easily recognizable. And so it's a massive demonstration of the accuracy of the book of Isaiah, and honestly, a big critique of the biblical minimalists who said that the Bible's been changed, and if we ever found older copies, especially of the Hebrew Bible, we would see all these massive changes going on. And that's not the case. So that's what Joe Rogan is highlighting, and he's talking about that point here.
Of days that have to go by where people are telling the story exactly the same, and that it's entrusted in the hands of these very few people that are so dedicated to it that they get the exact words right 1,000 years later. Pretty bananas.
Well, I mean,
Yeah, pretty bananas is right. I mean, that's a very high demonstration of accuracy of copying. And what he's talking about is the oral culture and the transmission, which, again, our culture is a digital culture. That was a culture of memory. And so that was something that rabbis would have practiced. They would have memorized things. They're used to memorizing things. Today, we can't remember our own phone number or our friend's phone number because we have technology that does that for us. But in their world, they had cultivated very sophisticated ways of passing on information. And the Hebrews, the Jewish people, were people of the book. And so they took these writings very, very seriously. So 2 points that Joe Rogan has already mentioned here is one, just this explosion of Christianity. Where did that come from? And now even the historical accuracy of copying in the book of Isaiah that this apologist Wes here has talked about. And so it's a pretty fascinating part of this discussion so far.
that is kind of the crazy thing about Christianity, where you have this Jewish itinerant guy who's walking around first century Roman occupied Judea. He's making some pretty audacious claims to be God himself, and then he predicts his own death and resurrection. And then his disciples.
Yeah, and notice the point that he's making here about Jesus, who's predicting his resurrection, which he did, and his disciples are proclaiming these things. They weren't expecting everything to happen, even though Jesus was telegraphing and told them in historical biographies of Jesus. That's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so it's a pretty remarkable historical footing with which this conversation is happening, because I think Joe Rogan is hungry to kind of look into, okay, what are the truth sources? What are the things we can actually learn about this person, Jesus of Nazareth, and what happened to him, his fate, and even the birth of Christianity?
They think it's over. Like, they're like, he's dead. We're done.
Yeah.
And then they go from 11, scared men, because Judas commits suicide, scared men in an upper room, to completely overhauling the Roman world in only a couple hundred years, because of this claim that they say they saw Jesus resurrected. Like, there's something different that goes on there, that they're like, this is a miracle, right? Dead people don't usually rise from the dead.
So what is your personal belief?
Yeah, and so I don't want to underscore or overemphasize how important that is, because what he's saying is, like, something had to transform the disciples. And different people have made this argument. Eminent scholar Gary Habermas, in his minimal facts approach. I've done videos on the resurrection. I've talked about that in my book, Questioning the Bible. But what he's talking about is the fact that something happened, and there's certain things you have to explain when it comes to the belief of the disciples. It's not just that they believed it. You have to, just because you believe something doesn't make it true. That's bad thinking. What the point that has to be explained historically, and scholars like Gary Habermas and others have documented this, is that you have to explain how that belief came to be. How do you get the transformation of the disciples? And a good explanation explains what needs to be explained. And a historian doesn't just want a possible explanation, they want a probable or reasonable explanation. They want the best explanation, and they want the earliest and best sources, which are the first century biographies of Jesus, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And we'll talk about some of these sources here in a minute. Now, Joe Rogan's going to ask a question about his own beliefs on this in a second, and we'll dive into that.
When it comes to the resurrection, what do you think do you have a belief, or do you just try to interpret the text and try to see what is the message?
Well, I think so. As a historian, I do think it is a historical question. You have a guy who objectively lived.
And that's important. This is a historical question. This is not just something that is that we're looking at as wishful thinking or a magic carpet or a genie in a bottle or something like that. There are real historical sources, at least 18 independent sources for the existence of Jesus of Nazareth. There's 12 Greco-Roman and Jewish by historians Josephus or Roman historian Tacitus or other people like that. I've talked about Josephus in a video here. Watch that link about what we know about Josephus and Jesus. We talk about who did he claim to be? Did he prove to be God? Did he claim to be God? That's a really popular video, kind of diving into some of these themes as well. But the idea here that I want you to underscore is that Joe Rogan is being confronted in a good way, because I think he's an open-minded person seeking the truth of what are the sources. And this is a historical question. This isn't just a quote-unquote faith question, and that's really important.
He objectively died, and then individuals close to his inner circle.
And that's really good too, that one of the most well-established facts of the resurrection is the fact that Jesus of Nazareth was publicly executed. He existed, and he also died, because the Romans were really good at that. He didn't just appear to die, he actually died. And there would have been eyewitnesses, because the Romans always wanted to crucify victims as a warning to everyone else, saying, hey, don't mess with Rome. And that's a really important point, because there would have been public eyewitnesses to these events.
Claim that they see him not dead.
Right.
Again.
This is a highly unusual activity.
Highly unusual.
Right. So, but it's hard when you're dealing with illiterate populations, you're dealing with thousands of years of time, you're dealing with an oral tradition, and then you have us sitting here talking about it in 2024, trying to figure it at the end of 20.
Yeah, and so how do you investigate a question about the past? Which is a great question. I love that Joe Rogan is asking this question. And it's awesome, because how do you investigate a question of the past? Well, you can't do it scientifically, because it's the wrong tool for the job. Science is wonderful, but you can't recreate the past. Historians rely on evidence and testimony, which is the rational inquiry into the past. Every historian requires and relies on testimony. And so that's how you investigate. It's not a math proof. You can't solve this in a laboratory. That's not the way history works. And so history deals with probabilities. And what you're looking for is what is the most reasonable belief when it comes to the fate of Jesus of Nazareth. And so that's an important point that I think Joe Rogan is wrestling with in a great way to think about how do you investigate the past, even in 2024.
2024. Trying to figure this out. Literally the end.
Yeah.
Last couple of days. It's very difficult for anybody who thinks of themselves as an intelligent person who's secular.
Okay, real quick. So he's about to make a point, and he's talking about a secular person. Now, a secular person is someone who doesn't believe in anything supernatural or God or anything like that. You can't appeal to anything. Secularism, by the way, is not neutral. That's not the rational starting point. It is a worldview with certain assumptions about God and morality and truth and knowledge and all those kind of things like that. And so he's talking about kind of maybe the barriers that some people have of belief in the 21st century.
To even entertain the possibility that someone died and come back to life.
And I get that. But we've already talked about the fact that we don't think that the only thing that exists is matter and motion. We as in you and I, right? Like, we believe that there's something else going on in this world that's a little bit crazy.
There's something else.
And
that's really important. There is something else. And so here's the thing. How do you investigate the past is a historical question. The fate of Jesus and the question of miracles, well, if we're going to say miracles can't happen because miracles can't happen, that's arguing in a circle. It's assuming what you're trying to prove. C.S. Lewis in his book Miracles responded to that argument, as well as plenty of agnostic philosophers. You can't just assume that miracles can't happen because science has shown they can't. What you do is you go, if it's at least possible that God exists, then miracles become possible, and then you investigate them on a case-by-case basis. We don't want gullibility. But here's the thing, and I've done a whole video on this in terms of making the case for God and why belief in God is reasonable, so you can click on that in the link as well. But if beginnings require beginners, the cosmology and the origin of the universe, the beginning of life, the origin of consciousness, the origin of life, the complexity of life, the moral laws require moral lawgivers, design requires designer, and other things like that, you've got good reason to at least get the God question on the table. And I've written a book on this with my co-author Sean McDowell on this called Is God Just a Human Invention?, in which we dive into these arguments that hopefully Joe Rogan and others would consider around this conversation, which is fascinating. And so the fact that Joe Rogan is open to belief in God and recognizing historical sources and recognizing the rapid explosion of the Christian faith, because you have to have a big enough cause to explain an effect. And if you have this church in Christianity that came out of Judaism with no historical precedent and no motivation internally, a resurrection from the dead would do that. N.T. Wright in his books has talked about that as well. And so you see, you've got to explain things. Historians can't just say something happened. You've got to go, no, well, what happened? What explains these things? And it seems like Joe Rogan is open to the possibility of God, which is super exciting and fun to think about, because as popular of a podcaster as he is, and he's really a truth seeker, and I think that's one of the reasons why he's so popular, is people are resonating with him just asking questions that everybody has about reality and the biggest questions of life.
And that to, I think, exclude that, I think excludes something that you're kind of putting blinders on for. And you do have, I mean, you're right in terms of all of these ancient conventions and the ways that things were spread around. But the Gospels are written in the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. And they're written in this period of time where you have groups of individuals who could have fact-checked those things. So,
yeah, and that's important. And Richard Bauckham in his book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, talks about this. They would have been able to be the guarantors of the traditions that were been passed on. They would have gotten the stories right. Anytime you see names in the gospel accounts themselves, the historical biographies of Jesus, Rufus or Jairus' daughter, Jairus would have been an eyewitness, other people like that. And so those are historical sources and eyewitness testimony, especially like Luke's prologue, Luke 1:1-4. I've investigated everything carefully, checking this with eyewitnesses so that you may know the exact truth about what you've been taught. That's Luke 1. And so the intro to Luke and his biography of Jesus. So again, they were aiming at historical credibility and historical inquiry that fit the pattern of the ancient world. And therefore, it's really important that we entertain it as such.
How do you fact check someone coming back from the dead?
Well,
how many people saw his body, right?
Well, Paul says that 400 people saw him all at once.
For how many people saw the crucifixion?
No, saw the resurrected Jesus. Yeah, 1 Corinthians.
Yeah, 1 Corinthians 15 is what he's going to talk about here. And so this idea that Joe Rogan is asking is, how do you fact check it? Well, there's historical evidence and there's eyewitness testimony. And there's also the transformation of the disciples. There's the transformation of Paul. There's the empty tomb. There's the fact that, you wouldn't make this thing up. It happened in the very place that it occurred, Jesus' death. It's called the Jerusalem factor. Gary Habermas talks about this. They could have found the body, but they said, guess what? The Jewish leadership said someone stole the body. And so they couldn't produce the body to say, hey, here's your risen Messiah who's dead, actually. And then the fact that you've got enemy attestation that they stole the body. And then the fact that you have a group of Jesus women followers finding the empty tomb. That would have been embarrassing detail historically. You wouldn't have included that in all four Gospels if it didn't actually happen. And so that's important to think about. And so if you're not going to rule out miracles as a presupposition, which I think is not good thinking, that's just simply a logical fallacy and assuming what you're trying to prove, then you've got all these historical effects that you have to explain. And the best explanation is that God raised Jesus from the dead. And 1 Corinthians 15 talks about that as the central claim of Christianity, because look, if Jesus is not raised, then your faith is worthless. There's no other religious text like that. And so it's fascinating to see Joe Rogan really thinking about these questions anew in this conversation, because he's saying it's difficult for people to believe this. But the problem is how do we investigate the past? How do we investigate miracle claims? If you're at least open to the possibility that God exists, and there's really good evidence that he does, then you can't rule out a miracle just out of the gate. And so I think it's fascinating to see Joe Rogan investigating questions around Jesus, God, the Bible, the resurrection, and asking, how do we know the truth about these things, which is what I hope you're doing as you're watching this. So I want to commend Joe Rogan for asking these questions, for having people on his show. So again, Wes Huff being able to talk about these things on the Joe Rogan show is a great thing, because he's introducing this whole audience to a conversation around this. And so what I want to encourage you to do is ask the question, how do you investigate the past? I've got videos on this in terms of the case of the resurrection. There's links in the show notes and right above as well. But you need to investigate this question. It is the central question of Christianity, and it rises or falls on the resurrection, not just some moral teacher and anything else. And so in this video, Joe Rogan has wrestled with the fact that the Bible is historically reliable, because he's talking about the Isaiah scroll and Qumran discovery and Dead Sea Scrolls, which backs up the accuracy and tracking that with the Masoretic text of the 1100 AD all the way back to about 200, give or take, BC, in terms of the accuracy of the Isaiah scroll. And then you've got the fact that he's investigating the eyewitnesses of Jesus, which is a historical question. But the big thing is I think the fact that Joe Rogan is at a place culturally, and I think people like Elon Musk and Richard Dawkins are as well, where they're asking these questions at a cultural Christian level. I don't think Joe Rogan is a cultural Christian yet. I think Elon Musk and Richard Dawkins are cultural Christians. They're open to those things for different reasons. But I love the fact that Joe Rogan is open to something out there is happening. And this had to be miraculous, this explosion of this thing called Christianity. And it's bananas that you have this accuracy that as he talked about. So I think this is a fascinating discussion, and I think you're going to find Joe Rogan asking more of these questions, and I pray that he will engage more and more on this topic, because you're watching this at home and maybe you've never asked these questions, or you're watching this. This is a big question, and there's a lot of good evidence. And so I've written on this in Questioning the Bible. My book on this is God, Just Human Invention. I teach on this with students. So there's a lot to investigate if you've never investigated the question of Jesus, the resurrection, and the historical evidence for the origin of Christianity. Because how do you go from in 20 BC, there's no such thing as Christianity, and then 120 AD, you've got literally Roman officials writing to the emperor, what do we do with all these Christians? You've got to explain it. Jesus is claiming to be God. The people are worshiping him as God. His predominantly Jewish movement. How do you get a Jewish Messiah out of that? The questions of all that, the Trinity and Jesus being divine. And we'll cover all that in different videos as well. But this is a fascinating conversation, and I'm really encouraged to see Joe Rogan on this. And I want to encourage you to be open-minded in this way like Joe Rogan is, and investigate the evidence for yourself, because I think you'll be pretty surprised and encouraged by what you'll find. I've come to a conclusion that this stuff's actually true, and because it is, it changes everything, and that's what I hope you will see as well. So we'll see you in the next video.